Thank you for listening. This is Vital for Colorado Radio. My name is Jon Ekstrom. We are part of the Connect and Collaborate Network. I am your on-air producer. With us, as always, is our chairman and CEO, also serving as our host, Peter Moore. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, John, and we're so happy to have Ed Sealover from the Denver Business Journal, and it's always become the most predominant paper in the state and the city, for sure, from my point of view.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that.
And so I'm real pleased to have you here, and we're going to be talking about election stuff.
Absolutely.
And the fall and what happens after June 26.
Yep, we will start with a look back, and then we will provide a look ahead. This is part of Vital's overall radio portfolio, which you can find on vitalforcolorado.com. Go to the Learn tab. There's a tab that says Videos and Podcasts. You can find all of our episodes there. Also, cobrt.com/radio. Search Vital for Colorado. You can find all of our episodes. And Ed is here because you cover a number of beats for the Denver Business Journal. Ed, can you give a rundown of everything that you're sort of doing there?
For the Denver Business Journal, I cover state government, transportation, economic development, healthcare, hospitality, tourism, and the beverage industry.
Those are wildly different from each other.
They very much are. It's a little bit of a mishmash, but all things that I've come to have some slight expertise in, or in the case of transportation, EcoDevo, gotten tossed on my plate in the last couple of months.
And so what is your expertise in particular with regard to the brewing industry?
I have been covering the beer industry since 2003, when I did my first column as the beer columnist for the Colorado Springs Gazette, and I now have written 2 books about beer as well as covering it for the Denver Business Journal.
One of which I actually own, and it's terrific.
And I appreciate that. Yes.
Well, you're the first serious beer drinker that I've ever met, so I'm pleased to meet you for that reason.
Peter, I'm right here.
Okay. Holy cow. I have a couple of experts in a very important industry.
Well, as long as we're talking about it, Ed, I had the pleasure of going to WeldWorks for the first time last weekend. And
for the WeldWorks Invitational?
No,
okay.
No, I was just there. We took the kids up the road, and they are doing incredible work. They have an enormous tap list. I was very, very surprised by that.
Enormous tap list, enormous program of barrel aging and of experimenting with different flavors.
Innovation.
I think WeldWorks has very quickly emerged to be one of the best breweries in Colorado.
I would be inclined to agree. What else have you had recently that you've enjoyed? You
know, I've been trying to drink a lot of New England-style IPAs this summer. I'm working on a column about it for my blog, but the one that I keep coming back to is Epic's Lupulin Burst. Is to me the kind of beer that redefines that style. Not just, hey, it's an IPA with some fruit in it. It's a really bold, flavorful beer, and I've been really enjoying that.
Interesting. I have not had that one yet. I recently had Tangerine Stuff from Cerebral, and that was quite good.
Okay.
And then I've been enjoying, this is not a New England, but Grapefruit Yanker IPA from Eddie Line.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
The grapefruit variation of their standard Crank Yanker IPA.
Yes.
Just the language you're using is great. I've been working on and all of this. Back when I was in graduate school a long time ago, in the late 70s, I was in Heidelberg in West Germany at the time. And in the old city, there was this bar called the Beer Museum. And I think they had something close to 200 draft beers and the old paddles, and these were actual kegs, and it was very, very old place. And I didn't know the right language to use, but I guess now that I know the right language, I was working on the summer of 1978 and going through that beer list, but I don't think I actually made it.
It's important to enjoy your work, Peter.
Yeah.
Find something you enjoy, you'll never work a day in your life, right, Ed?
This is great.
That's what I say, usually more often when I'm drinking beer than when I'm covering state governments.
Well, perfect. That segues perfectly into our discussion of state government. So we'll actually
one quick question before you got into the newspaper business. What background did you have, or do you have?
My background before the newspaper business was simply college student. I've been in it for 23 years now, since I graduated from Northwestern University. I've worked at papers in Fort Smith, Arkansas, Anderson, South Carolina, Colorado Springs, and up here in Denver. Have covered a variety of things, but have spent most of my career covering government and politics in some form or shape.
Did you have an interest in that, in journalism? Is that what you were sort of oriented towards?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I majored in journalism in college. Knew from an early age in high school that I wanted to go into it, and just something I've always wanted to do. I love writing, and I love learning, and this is a way to really put the two of them together, and hopefully, if I do it right, have other people learn because of things that I write.
Well, that's a great school for journalism.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it quite a bit.
So perfect. One of the main things we want to talk about is the primary took place on June 26th, and this is airing about a week and a half later. And so, first of all, just what were your overall takeaways from the primary? Some top-line things.
That despite the presence of unaffiliated voters, I don't know how much they impacted the primary. I think the primary was more impacted by spending and by name recognition, which are two things that have dominated Colorado primaries for the 18 years that I've been here in the state, and that things didn't seem to change too much, especially based on what could very much be seen as the most liberal of the four Democratic candidates getting through. And while Stapleton may not have been quite as conservative as Greg Lopez, he was awfully close on the Republican side as well. So I think different methodology, same results.
Yeah, which is interesting to me because one of the sort of stated not goals but possible outcomes of having unaffiliateds involved in this primary election was potentially getting more moderate candidates, but it almost seemed to serve as a rubber stamp for the two frontrunners.
In some way, and it may have been what was unique about this race. Stapleton not only had the financial advantage based on his backers and his the PAC supporting him's ability to raise money, but he had by far the name recognition among the four candidates that ended up on the ballot. And so I think that goes a long way in a primary. Now, on the Democratic side, it was interesting. I think you had some decent name recognition across the board for a lot of those candidates. But I think what it came down to, aside from Jared Polis dumping $11 million of his own funds into the race, was the idea that Polis had also built up name recognition specifically among a dedicated Democratic primary voting base, and that was environmentalists and social liberals, for that matter. And so I think that while someone like Mike Johnson or Donna Lind certainly would have presented as a more moderate candidate, more appealing to unaffiliated, and I think Mike Johnson's surprising results on the night of the election showed he actually did pull, we'll never know this for sure, but I think he pulled a lot of unaffiliated votes there. I think in the end, it's still a game of getting your party base out there, and that's how you win a primary.
But I think Representative Polis was still 20 points ahead of Johnson in the primary.
I think 21. He was 20 ahead of Kerry Kennedy, 21 against Johnson. I was just referencing that most polls had Johnson at 8 or 9%. He ends up with 24% in the primary.
That's a strong showing. And to your point about name recognition, in terms of Secretary Stapleton, it's not every candidate that gets airtime in the middle of Mile High Stadium, you remember the great Colorado payback? So people could see his name. They go, oh, yeah, I remember that guy. He's the guy who wants to refund us our money.
There's a reason that the Treasurer's Office has been the jumping-off point for gubernatorial candidates for more than 30 years in this state. It's because generally the only time you get your name out there is when you're telling people that you have money to give to them. It's an office that doesn't create a lot of controversy. Nobody is coming in day after day saying, I don't like the returns on the state's portfolio. And so it's really a chance to kind of use as a springboard, and frankly, I think that's why you saw such a crowded field in both the Republican and Democratic primaries for treasurer this year. They see that opportunity looming ahead.
Well, there's big money certainly in the race for governor, but there's also big money. Brian Watson, $700,000 for the state treasurer's office, and some of the other candidates were $50,000 and $250,000. So it also was a factor of 10 times or 3 times what the other people were doing.
Yeah, I think when you combine Watson and Lawrence, they were 10 times what Justin Everett spent, and I reference that because Everett said that to me in his kind of concession text that he sent me. Is, look, we tried, and his internal polling had showed him up for a while, but the more that Watson spent, the more people began to see that, and the more they began to associate his ads, his name with, hey, I could vote for that guy.
So really big money for primaries, that's healthy for democracy, right?
I would say that the primaries themselves have been tough in attracting people. I was glad to see we got 1.17 million Coloradans voting in the primary this year.
That's true.
And I think that was healthy for democracy. But in truth, people in the back of their minds, even if they are politically astute, but not necessarily political watchers like you and I are, tend to think of elections as something that you start getting ready for in October, or in the old school, at least after Labor Day. Even for people who care about these things, I think the primary springs up on them, and you've got a minimal amount of time to prep yourself. And so in that case, name recognition is what preps you. And if you're getting direct mail pieces and you're seeing ads, that is what people count as prepping themselves.
Well, we're doing this show in the very, very beginning of July, and the election is really not until November. But at least for a lot of people I know, it's on. It's on right now.
Oh, yeah.
It is very much on, and you saw that in the way that both Walker Stapleton and Jared Polis framed their primary night victory speeches. There was a lot of, hey, I love you, you've all been wonderful, thanks for voting for me, but both of them went right to the jugular as well. I mean, and normally that's a role of the parties to go to the jugular, and we've seen that in the down ballot races. Both of them had no problem talking about each other, and quite frankly, Walker Stapleton has been running against Jared Polis for over a year now. I've seen this over and over again at events I've attended, where people will ask questions, and at least once a forum or debate, Stapleton will turn to say, I'm doing this so Jared Polis can't.
And so the first move is to put each other candidate in a box, have 3 or 4 taglines for that box, and say he's this, he's that, and be able to control the high ground.
Yes, I think it's special interest Stapleton versus far left radical Polis. That's what I'm seeing coming out of the national parties right now.
That's right.
So, yes.
And I think there's even a website.
SpecialInterestStapleton.com. Yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm advertising for either party here, but yes, that went up before I think most people had woken up the day after the primary.
So you and John were talking about the independents, and it's probably going to be some time to figure out what the role really was. I think that's not well understood. But this was the first election that they could vote in either primary.
Yeah, absolutely.
And because of the amendment for the last statewide election. And I wrote down somewhere that something like 2% of the people voted for both parties, which sounds crazy. But it's actually a much lower percentage than people were anticipating, because people were anticipating people would have no idea what to do with this new power.
Yes, no, and the Secretary of State's race sunk a lot of money into a campaign to let people know you can only vote one ballot if you're going to vote them. And I think that actually paid off a little bit. But yeah, I'm hoping that by the next primary election will be well under 1%. People will get this, but this was a new thing for people to absorb. And frankly, I think that's why one of the interesting stats that I saw from this is that of the independents who voted, more than half of them voted in the last 4 days of the primary.
Wow.
I think a lot of people were waking up to the fact that you're voting. I mean, I think a lot of them were also looking at the number of races and trying to take them in. I will just say I was rather shocked to hear that my story on our Democratic treasurer primary on our site, DenverBusinessJournal.com, ended up being one of the most viewed stories for several days in a row on our national sites, and we're part of a 40-paper chain.
Right.
And then I realized that probably people were scrambling at the end because there had been almost nothing written about that, and that was the one place they could go to. So I think a lot of people were really trying to cram in their knowledge and vote at the very end here.
Well, for a fellow that went to school in Chicago, doesn't that sound wrong that you only can vote for one party?
Yes, yeah. Not only that, it appears
vote often.
Appears that only the living voted in this primary as well. This is very strange. Yes.
I'm really anti-dead people discrimination here, so that's really, really unfair. But it was interesting because I'm a registered unaffiliated, and you get both of them, and it's kind of funny. I wonder if a lot of people did what I did, where you go, okay, there are people I like on this side and I want to vote for them, or and then there are races over here that I care about. It may not be the same race, but it's almost like, what if I could vote Democrat governor and then, Republican state treasurer or something. I wonder if people got a little bit too heady and started to cherry pick in that way. Because
yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I think if you were passionate enough to do your homework and dig in, and it seemed like we saw more stories about the double voted ballots coming in early in the process. I think these were people who got it, said, "Oh, look, neat." Boom. I think the people who were really digging in were probably a little bit more able to discern they could only vote one. I will say this. I think that while the impact of the independents may not have been seen in this election, and I say may not have been seen because I'm curious how much the unaffiliateds ended up swaying the very, very tight Democratic AG primary, where you had Joe Salazar, a very liberal candidate, arguably the most liberal candidate for any office on the ballot, versus Phil Weiser, who at least tried to run a more down-the-middle campaign. They may have waited on that. But either way, I think the impact of seeing Polis and Stapleton come out of these primaries for unaffiliateds who are the true moderate unaffiliateds, and a lot of unaffiliateds are the ones that think the Democrats are too conservative and the Republicans are too liberal. But I think it will wake people up, and they will be voting in bigger numbers in 2020, saying, I didn't like what I saw with such, more end of the ideological spectrum candidates coming out of this. Maybe next time I will put my vote in.
So, Ed, I want to come back to something real quick. I saw a video of you online talking about Mike Johnston.
Yes.
About how
was this in a Johnson fundraiser ad?
I believe it was.
Yeah, I heard about that.
I was targeted, as I'm unaffiliated, by both sides. So
I'm sure your consent form was signed beforehand, right?
But it said that he polled better against the Republican field than anyone else on the Democratic side.
Yes.
What was it about him that polled better against Republicans? And then, two-part question. First of all, what contributes to that? And then secondly, where does he go from here?
And just to explain why I ended up in a fundraiser against my knowledge, that was something I said on the TV show Colorado Inside Out. I'd been told by a leader of a business group they had seen polling that paired Stapleton against Polis, Kerry Kennedy, and Mike Johnston. And my point was that they polled in reverse order against Stapleton versus how they were doing the Democratic primary. The polls would start out fairly even. We've seen a Democratic poll that shows him up 8 points, but frankly, 5% is the margin of error at this point. So that Kerry Kennedy had a significant lead on Stapleton if he were to win, and that Mike Johnson had such a big lead on Stapleton, it might give people pause to think about whether they wanted to contribute to the Stapleton candidacy nationally. And so that of course, now that I think about it in retrospect, that ended up in Johnson's fundraising appeals. But I think what unaffiliated saw in Johnston was, one, a little bit of a fresh face. I think both Polis and his ties to the environmental movement and Kerry Kennedy and her ties to the teachers union may have linked them as more traditional Democratic candidates. For people who were looking for the middle, Mike Johnson as a guy who had grown his reputation as an education reformer, and who, frankly, if you see him speak, he is the most polished, I felt, of all the candidates on the trail.
I definitely agree.
Reached out to them. And so I think it says a couple of things, that Johnston should have a future somewhere out there in politics. He's got to figure out how to hone his message, and he's got to figure out how to do it in an ultra-partisan primary divide. And secondly, I think it shows that people voting in the primary still may not be willing to reach in the middle. And just to be clear, Mike Johnson wasn't that far in the middle. He was the one talking about gun control more than anyone else on the Democratic ballot. But he was attacked, for example, by the teachers union because he's been a big charter school proponent. And so I think clearly, and I think Kerry Kennedy, frankly, also still has a future. She showed more gumption than people expected at the beginning of this race. But they've got to figure out where to pick their spots. The biggest thing is you probably pick your spot against someone who's not going to dump $11 million of their own funding into the race. And
I think that's wise advice.
Just in terms of polls, though, I think there's a radical difference between polls in April and May versus polls in October, because the primaries, by their very nature, I guess irrespective of the concept that independents can now cast a ballot, are really partisan affairs. And it's a statewide race in October. And so I wonder if there's any direct relevance between the polls done in April versus the polls that might be done in October, and then even think about the polls that were done in the last election, which seemed to miss the mark widely.
I think the only direct relevance would be this, is that the polls that were done in April, I mean, showed Jared Polis as a candidate. And just to be clear, and I think we're going to talk about this a little later, this is set to be a big Democratic year for the election. And this was a race that could have been over early. And I think the polls had showed that the independents are not sold on Polis yet. And this is not a race that's over early. They're willing to look at both sides. Whereas in other states and other races, independents automatically think, I'm tired of what's going on in D.C. I'm voting for the Democratic candidates. And I think that's the value of the polls we've seen so far.
In terms of, I guess, putting the gubernatorial candidates in boxes, the one commonality that I saw is that both boxes are working for working families, which is what Representative Pola is working for. And I think Mr. Stapleton is saying, keep jobs.
Yeah.
And you know, if you vote for me, you'll have a job. You vote for the other guy, you won't. And in a certain way, they're both working for working families, but certainly characterizing it differently.
Well, and to be sure, I think it's fair to say I can't remember a gubernatorial election in the time I've been here where the candidates have such ideological differences about the function of state government and what needs to be done to continue the economy. That's about the only thing they both agree on, is we've got a good economy. It could be better. And I think in some ways that's a great thing for the voters. I mean, this should be a candidate, should be a race about issues, because you don't need to call each other names. You can just lay your issues out there and show some vastly different perspectives. I mean, you've got on energy is I think the most obvious one. You've got Jared Polis, who has supported increased setbacks, who has said over and over again he supports more local authority, who wants to make it a 100% renewable energy grid by 2040. You have Walker Stapleton, who not only doesn't support more local authority, says he's going to use his office to go after local governments who try to usurp the state's rules on this. He supports continued propagation of the oil and gas industry. Really stands wildly apart from Polis on the role of renewables, saying it's fine with me, I just don't want to prop it up with subsidies.
Right.
Or even in an area like healthcare, which I think is about to become a big issue in this race, because you have Polis, who was the only Democratic candidate who came out swinging, saying, I want Canada-style single-payer universal health care, saying with the caveat, I'd rather not do it alone. I'd rather do it nationally or with at least a large coalition of states. But pushing that out there, as well as pushing things like increased health transparency, where Walker Stapleton is saying, no, what we need to do is we need to give insurers more freedom to put lower price plans out there, because we've seen that people aren't hip on buying these high price plans with a lot of requirements to it. He wants to push more care into retail settings, into community health centers, and it's going to be a pretty radical difference there. Yeah. If you can even get past one of those two and you don't know where you stand, you can find a lot of other areas where it's going to be about the issues. And frankly, I think that's a good thing.
Is there any other candidate running for a statewide office in the country pushing a single-payer plan, or is Jared Polis on his own in this one?
I am sure that somewhere in this country there is a Democratic candidate doing that. That said, I have not seen it become a prominent issue in a swing race yet. Right. I mean, I haven't read about one of the open governor seats where one or the other candidates is really pushing this, or even an open U.S. Senate seat. So I think in some ways people may be watching Colorado and trying to decide, well, if Polis gets elected, can this become an issue?
Well, and it's interesting to me because 2 years ago, we tried that. That was put on the ballot,
and it failed 4-1. And Polis has said, yeah, that wasn't written well, but I like the idea. So it's a bit of a gutsy move on his part to be this far forward on it, because voters have already shown they don't like at least how it was presented the first time.
Right.
in terms of gutsy moves, I was thinking that that's a gutsy move, I think, on the part of Representative Polis, and then Walker Stapleton tied, at least at the primary level, himself so much to President Trump. And so much is unknown between now and, let's say, October in terms of national presidential politics. And can he untie himself, or is that bond made forever?
And we are going to get into that in our next segment. We will have more with Ed Sealover from the Denver Business Journal, Peter Moore, the president, chairman, CEO. He's got a lot of titles here with Vital for Colorado. I'm Jon Ekstrom, your on-air producer. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us here on Vital for Colorado Radio. I am Jon Ekstrom, your on-air producer, sitting in with Peter Moore, the chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado.
Well, thanks a lot, John. And we have Ed Sealover from the Denver Business Journal, and you have 6 primary portfolios, and we're talking about politics, state politics.
And we did talk a bit about healthcare in that last segment, and we were wrapping up.
And a little bit about beer, so.
Yeah.
And all of this relates, from your point of view, to business.
Yes, absolutely. That's the lens that I tried to see these on. I'm less inclined to watch the legislature from the horse race perspective as much as what are the policies going to mean here. Well,
and I think that's interesting, too, because we're in a very challenging media environment, but the Denver Business Journal has continued to grow. Even in challenging times. What do you attribute that to?
I think people are looking for more specific sources of news these days than they used to. I think the general interest paper that used to unite our communities back in the 50s and 60s has kind of seen a bit of a trouble grabbing eyes. I mean, you think about, and everybody used to go to the sports section. Now you can probably get Denver sports in about 12 different outlets right now.
At least.
And so we've really tried to be, the place you go for Denver business. There are other places as well, but if I may be so bold, I don't think anybody covers the business of government quite the way that we do. And so you have to kind of build up that specific audience there. And that is going to be key, especially as we see some of these news sites like the Investigative Colorado Sun launching here. I think everybody's going to be looking for that niche that you have to get into for people who are willing to give just a certain portion of their time and their budget to journalism. You have to be able to fill what they need in there.
That's interesting to me.
As a quick ad for Vital for Colorado, we're really, organized around trying to be the voice of business as it relates to all of the energy issues that exist. And we've been around since the summer of 2013. We're organized around a 7 Principles pledge. We now have had close to 87,000 people in the state sign that pledge, and over 1,000 businesses, a different version of it, a couple hundred politicians, and I think all the trade associations have signed the pledge. So we're trying to, from a nonpartisan point of view, we're trying to, educate and advocate as it relates to the shifting scene, as it relates to all of the energy issues. And that's really kind of the purpose of the show. And so thank you for being on this show, because we're trying to educate people. So the state races, I guess we talk about the governor's race, and that's a very, very important issue for 2018. But the state races, in terms of who controls the state house, why is that important in 2018, and what's going on?
Well, why it's important in 2018 is for the past 4 years, Democrats have controlled the House of Representatives, in the state. The Republicans have controlled the state Senate, and a fairly moderate Democratic governor has controlled the governor's mansion.
Right.
The Democrats only need to flip 1 seat in the Senate. They are not, unless this is a shocking reverse trend of what we're expecting, they're not going to lose the House. And they go into the governor's race at least even, if not with a slight lead, and with certainly a more liberal governor, more candidate than John Hickenlooper was as governor. So why it's important is that the Democrats are not that far away from taking hold of all 3 areas of the government here. Now, for some people, that is pure bliss. There has been a lot of things that did not get through the House and the Senate the past 4 years. Both sides. You see a lot of Senate bills dying in the House. You see a lot of House bills dying in the Senate. You probably saw or didn't see Governor Hickenlooper wiping his brow, not having to make a decision on a lot of those things that never ended up on his desk. But if Polis wins and the Democrats are able to take back the Senate, there's going to be a lot less checks in terms of what's going through.
Well, there'll be one check, though. You need to balance the budget every year.
Well, absolutely. You need to balance the budget. And when I say a lot less checks, I mean just in terms of putting the Democratic viewpoint through, which, Republicans, in some ways, I guess, have been seen as stopping the last 4 years because they only own, by one seat, one of the three branches of government at the state capitol. Right. And so I think that's why people should be paying attention to that. And particularly, I think there's going to be three races that are going to decide the fate of the Colorado State Senate this year. We're looking at races in Senate, and I'm using a cheat sheet here to get the numbers down. Senate District 20, which is in the Wheat Ridge, Eastern Jefferson County area, between it's an open seat that's being given up by Sherry John, a Democrat turned independent. It'll be a race between...
Very moderate Democrat. Too.
Yes, very moderate Democrat. A woman that I once highlighted as the most powerful person in the Capitol in 2014 when the Democrats held the House, the Senate, and the governor's mansion, but she was a block on a lot of things that a lot of people in her party wanted to put through the Senate.
I remember that article.
Yeah.
I remember reading that because we knew Sherry John through oil and gas measures. It was Sherry John, I think Mary Hodge,
and Lois Tocktrop.
And my wife actually interned for Lois Tocktrop for a brief time many years ago, and so I had great affection for Lois Tocktrop. So knowing who some of these folks are and when they have very nuanced positions like that, it was great to see Sherry highlighted in that way.
Yes, yeah, and so that's a key race. That is the three that are really viewed as the key races. That's the one that's held nominally by a Democrat. A Democrat was elected in that seat. She turned into an independent, but it'll be a race between State Rep Jesse Danielson, a Democrat, and Christine Jensen, a Republican businesswoman. The other two races that are going to decide this, Senate District 24 out in Adams County. That is a seat that was won somewhat surprisingly by Beth Martinez-Humanic, a Republican, in 2014. That flipped the Senate from Democrat to Republican. She's going to try to hold on to that seat against Representative Faith Winter, who is known as a good fundraiser and kind of a charge hard, knock on every door person. Winter is a Democrat. She's been in the House for, I believe, 4 years now. And then Senate District 16, which is in the northwest and western Jefferson County, all of Clear Creek, and I think it goes slightly into about two more counties as well. But that's State Senator Tim Neville, a Republican, versus Tammy Story, a Democratic challenger. Neville is known by his own accolades as one of, if not the most conservative Republican in the Senate. It seems to be an odd position for somebody who has won a swing seat. He's also one of the most door-knocking, get-out-there-and-work members of the Senate, and it'll be very interesting to see how the voters in that district appraise him after 4 years in voting him in as well.
Are you aware of whether there is serious national money coming in for these races? I read a few stories. I don't recall if it was DBJ or elsewhere, but I've read something where that might happen, but I don't have any knowledge as to whether it has happened.
It might happen. I think the lay of the land nationally has got to be determined before people are going to start dumping money into state house races. I think most of the attention is still going to go to a U.S. Senate that suddenly appears in play, as well as a U.S. House that suddenly appears in play. And so I think you've got to be going a little farther down. All of these three Democratic candidates are women, and the reason that's important to know is I think you will see deep-pocketed groups like Emily's List, which comes in and backs local pro-choice candidates, come in and probably dump some money into there. But I think how much money flows in is going to be determined a little bit by where else that money has got to go.
Speaking of which, one of the races that is always targeted in Colorado in terms of the U.S. House is District 6. Mike Kaufman, I believe Jason Crow is running against him this year.
Absolutely.
What do you think Jason Crow's chances are?
I think his chances are good in a year like this. And the reason I hedge on that, and this is again going to be one of the top 10 democratically targeted seats in the House of Representatives. And it's going to be for the third year in a row. It's going to fall, the third election in a row. It's going to fall into that category. The trick is the last two times Democrats have targeted this seat, they've lost by pretty substantial margins. Andrew Romanoff in 2014, I believe, was 11 points. Morgan Carroll in 2016, I believe, was 9 points. Mike Coffman, if we're just talking about knock-on-doors, hardworking candidates, I think even Democrats would admit he's probably at the top of the list here for anybody in the state of Colorado.
The guy is a horse in his district.
He knows his district. He appeals to parts of his district that you wouldn't think would go behind a Republican. His is a heavily immigrant district, for example, and he is in very tight with the Ethiopian African immigrant groups in his district. And so I think Coffman's got a heck of a lot better chance of retaining this seat because of his history there than would a comparable Republican in a comparable seat with a comparable makeup. Sure. That said, the Democrats are going to dump a lot of money into this. Jason Crow is appealing in that he is a military veteran, and I think that's something that's going to not cancel out, but go right up against Coffman's military veteranness, and I think this is going to be a very tight race.
You know, the point you just made about the Ethiopian community, intuitively, you would think of, I guess, immigrant communities, of course, being associated with the Democratic Party, and I also am aware of the strong ties, and I don't know why they're the strong ties, but I assume that he's done something to help.
Well, he's done something
folks
to help set up an African-based business center in Aurora. I mean, and it's just, again, it's a lot about Coffman and his ability to work with groups within his community. That said, if this is as big a wave year as people think, even that might not be able to.
So why do people think it's going to be as big a wave here? I can see arguments pro and con, and you've really kind of mentioned that it's been kind of a sub rosa of almost all your comments.
Yes.
That if this year will become what I think it will become, but why?
Well, why? Traditionally, it's wave years to some extent, lesser or greater, in the first election after a new president is elected.
Right.
A lot of people want to shift back. There's usually, now that president's
to throw
in office,
the bums down, get
exactly.
New guys.
Hey, we loved him then, and oh wait, now we've seen him implement his policies. Let's shift back a little bit. Trump's favorable numbers are as low as any president since we've started doing these kind of things. He's almost in Harry Truman territory at this point, and so that's another reason people think it's going to be a bigger wave year than normal. Is that people are not just throw the bums out typical mentality, but there's a specific passion that Donald Trump sparks for throw him out of that office, and so I think that's what you're looking at. But the reason I hedge on all this, some people just assume it will be a big year, is that we didn't see Donald Trump coming in 2016 either, and I think we've gotten to the point where we're beyond what polling can tell us, that there are a substantial number of people who are going to go out there and vote in a way that you're not expecting them to. And I think especially of the people who voted for Donald Trump in Pueblo County. Donald Trump took Pueblo County in 2016. That's as blue a county as there is in the state of Colorado, and yet these are economically disadvantaged folks in that county who came in and said, nothing else has worked for us. Let's try this guy. Are people still going to want to try him, or after 2 years, are the people who voted for him going to wash their hands of him? That will lead, especially to these down ballot races, to a lot of what we see as the conclusions.
And also in a very, very strong economy. I don't think we've had an economy. I recall going to some of the economic forecasts in December of last year and January, and people had said it won't hit 3%, and 4% definitely won't do that. And we're there right now.
And that's a good point. I mean, when you have unemployment as low as 3% right now, you're looking at people that should be satisfied. Generally, good economy equals not turnover in office because people think that's fine. Trump has done things that have alienated people in ways that don't hit their pocketbooks.
Well, these numbers I was thinking of were actually GDP growth.
Okay, sorry. I thought you meant our low unemployment rate there.
No.
Yeah,
these are actual GDP growth, and all the economic forecasts fundamentally get down to what will the GDP growth be, and then people talk about the debt burden and as affecting that. Less than 2% is a weak economy. 2 to 2.5% is okay economy. 3%, and anything closing 4% is on fire economy. And I think nationally we're right there.
And are people going to be willing to mess with that? You know, again, it's a lot of the people who are going to go
President
cast
Clinton
ballots,
a long time ago had a well-known opinion on that.
It's the economy, stupid. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
James Carville, I believe, coined that. Getting back to the state, we talked about these down ballot races. Currently, Democrats hold a majority of 36 seats in the Colorado State House, and that is compared to 29.
Yes, 29 Republican seats.
So it seems fairly unlikely that the Republicans would be able to flip that, especially in a year, given everything that we're talking about, this coming potential blue wave. Do you think there will be additional attrition of Republicans in the House? Will it be a stronger Democrat majority?
If I were a betting man, I'd say it's going to be pretty close. Republicans are going to have trouble in a year like this defending some seats. They have one particular seat, House District 34, which is up in the Thornton area, that was very literally a gift seat to them. This is the seat that was won several times by Steve Lebsock, who decided to re-register as a Republican right before he got kicked out of the House this year. That's going to be, based on the voting numbers, a hard seat for the appointed Republican to hold there. At the same point, there's not a ton more places that Democrats can carve into. I think there are people that are looking at a couple of seats, one out in the Morrison area, one in the Pueblo West area, that could be interesting, especially because they have some controversial incumbents in them. But Republicans may have knocked that Pueblo West seat off the table themselves when they voted out Judy Raher, the controversial incumbent in the primaries. That may have taken away the controversy factor and put that more down to straight voting numbers. There is at least one seat that is worth watching for a potential Republican pickup. That's House District 17 in southeastern El Paso County. And the reason I say that seat is worth watching, it has flipped every election since 2008. Every 2 years, Republicans and Democrats trade that seat. And in fact, just in case you were wondering, will different candidates mean a different result this time? It's literally the third straight race that Kit Rupé, the Republican, has taken on Tony Exum, the Democrat. Rupé ousted Exum. Exum turned around and re-ousted Rupé, and she's going to for the hat trick of oustings here. So and I used to cover politics for the Colorado Springs Gazette, and I've never quite been able to explain why that district is so volatile. But it's one where people really like to throw the bums out.
Looking at this list of House races, I noticed also is a year of nicknames.
Yes. We were talking about
Thomas Exum is Tony, Catherine Rupé is Kit, and then why is Alexander Winkler skinny?
Well, he is very, very literally skinny. He is probably the skinniest member of the legislature. So I think he just earned that nickname over time. Yes.
I just had to know.
So pivoting slightly, in addition to candidates, which is your primary focus in terms of the coverage that you do, but you touch issues a bit, right?
Yeah, and I was going to say, this year is not going to be all candidate-based. There are a couple issues that are going to be very prominent, several around the oil and gas issue, and certainly 1 to 2 ballot initiatives about transportation funding that are going to be huge this year.
Tell us a little bit about those.
Okay, let me start with transportation funding. Right now, 2 separate groups are looking to put transportation funding initiatives onto the ballot. One is the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce and a coalition of other business and civic groups that wants to put a 0.62 cent sales tax increase for the next 20 years onto the ballot. They believe they can raise enough of that to fund $6 billion worth of bonds to take care of local highways, state highways, and transit projects. That will likely be on the ballot. Another one that I would put money being on the ballot as well, the Independence Institute, the free market Patriot think tank is putting up a measure that says the legislature has to dedicate $350 million a year from the general fund to transportation funding, and that they will use that to repay $3.5 billion worth of bonds that would go almost exclusively to repairing state highways, not transit or local roadways. And so voters may be faced with a choice. Which one of those would I like to vote on? Either, both, neither, probably not both. I suspect that'll divide people.
That would be strange.
Yes. And
was there something to blunt the $6 billion of bonds with $3 billion of bonds, or they arose independently?
Actually, the Independence Institute is a bit in reaction to the Chamber's efforts. The Chamber's been leading these efforts since 2017, when they tried to put through the legislature a similarly sized sales tax hike that would have gone on the 2017 ballot. That died in the Republican Senate. That died in the Republican Senate, and even during that time, John Caldera, the very outspoken CEO of the Independence Institute, said, look, this is not the answer. We don't need to raise taxes. We've got enough money in-house. And so he just turned that into a ballot initiative for 2018. So
there are two strong oil and gas measures that Vital for Colorado is very, very interested in. One is the setback issue. In 2016, has come back, and it's known as Initiative 97 at this point. Not known if it's going to be on the ballot. That'll be known by August 8 or so. Mm-hmm. I think the people I've talked to believe that it will get on the ballot.
It is very possible. Obviously, this is an issue that has been tossed around for three straight general election ballots.
So what's your take on it?
I suspect it will draw a lot of people out to vote if it gets on there. This is a setback initiative, for those who don't know it, that would require 2,500 feet between oil and gas wells and between pretty much any occupied building, correct?
But also
as well as streams.
Also any fields, streams, and areas of interest.
Areas of special interest, which is not all that well defined.
Yes, thank you.
And streams in Colorado are not that well defined either.
Sorry, I didn't know the exact specifics there in the language. Yes, I mean, if it gets on the ballot, and I don't have a crystal ball, this is obviously a group that got the signatures in 2014, had them pulled off because of a deal between Polis and Governor Hickenlooper to send this to a commission. Didn't like what the commission did in 2016, tried to get the signatures, not for this exact measure, didn't get any oil and gas on the 2016 ballot, and is back at it now. This is the kind of thing that's going to draw out people on both sides, is going to become centerpieces of candidacies for people who don't want to be discussing this as the center of that. And yeah, I mean...
so this is really interesting to me. Who knows what people will say in the future, but in the past, both Representative Polis and I'm sure Walker Stapleton has said no on 97 for a whole host of reasons. So here you have the two candidates saying no, yet it's probably going to get on the ballot, and the connection that you made is that it's bringing a lot of votes out. Yeah. Is it really designed to bring a lot of votes out?
I think any initiative...
Or is it designed to pass?
Any initiative with it... No. I mean, both. I mean, any initiative with a hot-button issue is not only designed to bring votes out, but to pass as well. And sometimes those can be cynical attempts to bring out your party's fervent left or fervent right base. Right. But these are people who really believe they want to get fracking wells as far away from humans as possible, and this is meant to pass as well. It will be curious. Stapleton will campaign hard against this. Polis has come out at a Colorado Association of Chambers of Commerce and Industry forum earlier this year and said, I oppose this.
That's right.
But he is financially backed efforts in the past to do 2,000 feet instead of 2,500 feet. How fervently will he oppose this now?
Right. And he has a lot of funding from the Sierra Club, I believe.
He does, but the Sierra Club hasn't waded into the Initiative 97 race yet. In fact, there's not any of the big money national backers you'd expect weighing into this right now. Will that change? We'll see.
So that'll not really be known whether it's on the ballot, I think, until August again, but that's not too far away. No. But that'll be a really hot issue. And then there's the takings issue.
And we've only got about a minute left.
Which is being pushed by the Farm Bureau. What's your take on that?
Basically, this is the issue that says if governments put something into play that takes away your ability to use your mineral rights, you get to be recompensated by the governments. I think this will be a strong one, too. I don't know that this brings out any different a crowd than 97 does. The only difference is the way they're voting on this one. I think it's going to be part of a big package that is going to really get people involved. The Initiative 108 could really do a lot for rural voters. Of course, there's still a small percent in terms of getting them out to the ballot to vote against it or to vote for it, but there are still a small percentage of the overall Colorado electorate.
Ed, where do we find out more about the DBJ, and where does, more importantly, one sign up and become a subscriber?
DenverBusinessJournal.com. Even if you don't want to lay down the money to become a subscriber, you can sign up for free for our morning and afternoon edition newsletters, which recap everything that we're writing on the day. People may not know, but probably 75% of what we do is just online now, so it's a good way to catch up with the news.
I am a subscriber, and I think it's essential to start my week.
Thank you.
And I read something in DBJ every day.
We will stay on top of all of these issues that we've been discussing.
Ed Sealover, thank you for being a guest here on our show this week. Peter Moore, a pleasure as always. You can find us at vitalforcolorado.com. Check out this show under the Learn tab, videos and podcasts, and we will see you back here very, very soon.